again. So before I hand it over, I do want to do like a small interstitial announcement of, I really want to say thanks both to our speakers today, as well as Brad, who was talking earlier, as well as Eric from MadJS, and Ben from the Madison Software Developer, Madison Web Design and Developer Meetup. That we all kind of been huddling on this idea of a joint meetup for probably not long enough, because we couldn't quite pull together every strand I wanted to, but we've been meeting for the last few months to kind of figure out what we're going to do for an event like this. And I just want to, thank them all for contributing. I never would have been able to do this. Well, we never would have been able to do this without everyone pitching in. So now, take it away, Steve, on JavaScript FrontEnds.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name's Steve. I'm going to be talking about JavaScript FrontEnds, or frameworks, libraries, tool sets. There's lots of different terms people use. My name's Steve Faulkner. I'm at South Pole Steve on the internet, everywhere. If you see that, it is me. I work for Murphy.com. I am one of the co-founders, and we're bad with titles, but I am kind of in charge of special projects and consulting, and I'll talk more about maybe what that is later. So just, I'm going to go over this real quick, but basically, JavaScript frontend, what is it? How does it work? So this is really simple model of how we kind of traditionally, I'll say traditionally, do web development, right? The server does some stuff, renders down HTML and CSS, goes to the browser. Maybe there's a little bit of JavaScript to show or hide things or do something fancy or animate, whatever. Something pretty simple. A JavaScript front end is the same thing, but it has a lot more JavaScript. And what that means is then it actually talks back to the server. And the way it does that is it does it through an API, which we just heard a bunch about. So hopefully everybody's on the same page with that and not confused. If you are, ask me later. Oh, by the way, feel free to interrupt with questions. I'll have questions at the end, but I don't mind if you stop me in the middle. So what happens is the initial request, you're going to get this big packet of JavaScript, and that's the app, and that's going to actually talk back to the server using an API, JSON, XML, maybe some other crazy thing I don't even know about. And a bunch of logic is actually going to live in the browser. So UX logic, display logic, maybe even some business logic, depending on how crazy you are. And then the cool part about this is then you can actually talk from the browser to other APIs if you want. You can talk to GitHub, you can talk to Twitter. If you're using a bunch of Twitter client stuff, you don't have to proxy that through your server or do something weird. You can just talk right from the browser to Twitter. Cool stuff. So I'm going to talk about kind of a little bit of how we got to where we are. This is probably totally wrong. So I have not been around that long. I'm not one of these old school web guys who was back in the 90s. So I'll probably mess some stuff up. So apologies in advance. So 1995, Brendan Knight creates JavaScript. Then some stuff happens. Honestly, you can go read about it if you want. I tried to read some about it and it wasn't that interesting or exciting. At some point, Microsoft invents Ajax, and there's even debate about that. And then a bunch of people spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to not write JavaScript. That's what actually happens. So it's funny if you go and try and look at the tools that people use. It's people went and deleted their blog posts. Everybody's ashamed of it. If you try to find, so in Rails land, there's this thing called RJS that was Rails would write your JavaScript for you, and then you never have to write JavaScript. And there's literally no stuff left on the internet about it. You go and there's some old Rails documentation, but people don't want to talk about it because it's bad. Okay, so then I'm messing with the dates a little bit, but somewhere in there jQuery got released, which I'm sure everybody's kind of familiar with jQuery. If you use JavaScript, it's hey, jQuery, right? Now we can do some same things on the client, and it's a little better, and we can fly in stuff from the side of the screen and woohoo. So just to walk through what that actually looks like. So this is I'm going to talk about this project later. This is a project here for the library, but it's a music player, right? And so if you can imagine, we want to play some music. So there's a play button over here. It's very small, hard to see. But if you click that, a bunch of stuff happens, right? So the play button actually turns to a pause button, and then it opens up the player, and we have the name of the song that's playing, as well as the next song, and the previous song, and all this stuff, right? So anybody who's kind of built these kind of interfaces with jQuery or you know, seen this kind of stuff before, you probably know how this goes, right? It's, you know, so it's callback hell, right? This is like where the term jQuery spaghetti comes from. So you can imagine that you have to like keep a bunch of state, you know, locked up in your browser, and you have to organize it somehow. And you have callbacks calling on things. And, you know, if we go back to this interface, imagine for a second, like, what happens if I click next up here and it goes to this song? Well, does the play button change down here to a pause button because it's playing the next song? It's like, well, it should, right? But did you remember to like execute that callback in the code, and did you do it all properly? And it's like, disaster. Okay, so like I said, this is an abbreviated, not so correct history of JavaScript. So people tried to fix this problem. Backbone was not the first thing that tried to do it. There's lots of other stuff out there. Angular was actually released before Backbone. But the Backbone really kind of like, you know, if we're looking at the revisionist history of JavaScript, it really kind of made this stuff take off, right? Somebody's like, okay, let's figure out a better way to do this. Let's try to make sense of this and actually make interfaces that just talk to the server and handle all their own views and templating and things like that. And it came out in 2010. It was only 600 lines of code. It wasn't actually, you know, that complicated of a solution. It was actually pretty simple. I remember when it came out and kind of not knowing any JavaScript at all, being like, oh, I kind of understand this a little bit. But it still took a while. I mean, 2010, that's 4 years after jQuery came out. And then this led then to this massive explosion, right? So now there are 8 billion JavaScript frameworks, and it's terrible, right? So to do MVC is where you go to find all about that. So I'm going to actually I'm going to be jumping back to the browser a few times here and awkwardly trying to figure out where my mouse is. Okay, this is the To Do MVC website. I highly encourage everybody to go check it out. It lists, basically, it's a place where they collected this simple to-do app written in various JavaScript frameworks, and every framework gets to write its own version, and so then you can see how they're all different. We can debate endlessly about if this is a good thing or not, if a to-do app is really representative of like how good a framework is. But if we go back to this, I'll show you. So I took a screenshot. This is the first section on the page. So there's multiple sections of frameworks. So this is just the first one. There's like 4 of them, what they call JavaScript apps. I have not even like heard of 3/4 of these until I looked at the page. And I was like, what? Like there are ridiculous amounts of JavaScript frameworks. There's even new ones that I have heard of that are not on this list. So it's a little ridiculous. So when I talked to Brian about this talk, you know, or sorry, Eric. I talked to Brian too. But when I talked to Eric about this talk, you know, he said, you want to do a talk on JavaScript front ends? And I was like, yeah, sure, but you know, okay, like which one am I going to talk about, right? Like, so I'm going to talk about all of them, right? Okay, not really, but I'm going to try. So disclaimer, like, I have not used a lot of these. I've actually just played around with some of them. Some of them I have used a bunch, so I may say something totally wrong. If you have more expertise in this framework, feel free to chime in afterwards. I'll probably say something wrong, like it's guaranteed to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into some kind of common features that you'll find in several of these, right? Like you'll find a feature that maybe 3 or 4 of them have. And let's look at why that feature exists and why you might care about it or not care about it. So the very first one, and this is like my favorite one, data binding, right? So you have an API, and you get some data from that API, and it gets into the browser, and then the user's doing something, and the data gets updated, right? So somehow a user interaction results in the model, however it's represented in the browser, being changed. You want the UI to update, right? You can imagine if you have a list of to-dos, and there's a count of the to-dos at the bottom, and I delete one, that count should update, right? Like there's all these parts that depend on one another. So for every one of these, I'm going to pick a framework that kind of excels at that particular thing, and we'll jump in. Angular's first. So I only talk about Ember at one of these. Everybody knows I'm like a big Ember fanboy, and I hate Angular, but you know, everything aside, Angular is actually pretty cool. It does a lot of very cool things, and you should check it out. So I'm going to show a quick JS fiddle of what this actually looks like, because it's pretty cool. More awkward mousing. Okay. So I realize it's a little small, but you can see down here there's a text input field, and then there's something down here, an H1 tag probably. So as I update this text input field, this changes down here, right? That's data binding, right? Like I made some interaction with the app, and then the app updates. Obviously, this is very simple. But you can imagine this can get a lot more complicated. You know, things are depending on other things and counts of things, and there's cascading stuff. And Angular makes this actually really easy. Like, so if you look, there's actually no JavaScript code in this app, right? This is all kind of built-in Angular stuff with its DOM templating. And I'm not going to try to go into too many details of how all these things work, but you can see here, we pull in Angular, and then we use Angular's templating syntax, which involves putting attributes that are not HTML valid on the input, and then it just works, right? Pretty cool. Yeah, Angular. All right. So,
It can be HTML, if you just put data in
correct. Right. So then the next thing I'm going to do with each of these is I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't use that framework, right? So this is like the troll section, right? And I'll do this with everyone, including Ember. So you know, so you go and you're like, wow, Angular is really cool. Like I want to use Angular. So you go to their website and you start digging around in their docs. And the best reason I come up with not to use Angular is because they just make weird words up, right? So that Angular like has all of these terms, and this is the best example is transclusion. This is not in the dictionary. This is not a real word. It is on Wikipedia, so you know, it's been used in computer science like since the 80s. But the other example of this is directive. They have this term directive, which everybody else in the JavaScript world just calls web components, right? I mean, that's like essentially what they are. But Angular people are like, no, they're not. They're not exactly web components. It's bullshit, right? So they just make shit up, and that's annoying. Just quickly too, if you looked at that list I showed you before. There's two Angulars on here, Angular.js and then Angular.js optimized. So interpret that however you want. That's a red flag for me. It means my first go is probably not going to work right or be shitty. Okay, so enough about Angular. Done with that. So number two, this is the number two thing that you might be looking for, DOM manipulation, right? So you get some data from the API, and then you represent it in your whatever model you're using, or just in a plain old JavaScript object. And you want to then manipulate the DOM in some way to represent that data, whether it's a template or update an existing DOM or something like that. So a quick example of what this might look like is you might have a template. This is handlebars syntax that has an album, and then you have an image representing that, and as well as the title and the main artist, right? You got some data down, and you want to represent it in a list. So let's talk about this for a sec. Just like think about it before we dive into how this works. Say that the server is updating in real time. I got some other fancy framework that's taking care of that. And I'm sending out an update in the URL for the album art changes, right? So what do I do? If I'm, the framework, do I re-render this entire template? Do I just pick out this one part and re-render that? Do I actually execute some method on this DOM element that updates the attribute, right? And realistically, if you're doing simple stuff, probably doesn't matter too much. But when you start getting into really complicated things, or you're making a game or stuff that's animating or updating really quickly, you're going to run into problems. Because basically every time you throw away HTML, you're also re-rendering and executing a redraw in the browser, causes all kinds of problems. There's like efficient ways and there's not efficient ways to do this. So the one that I think really tackles this the best is React, which is created by Facebook. So it's their kind of JavaScript framework. So I will show you an example of what this looks like. Okay, this is what React looks like. I'll just show you actually a quick example of maybe what this React stuff does. Okay. So this is some JavaScript over here, React, right? So it's doing stuff with React, and then this is the element that it's actually rendering, right? It's telling how many seconds have elapsed since I updated this page. Like I said, I don't want to get into too much of the details about like how this actually works, but you can imagine at scale, if you want to do that efficiently, then, oops, I'll show you an example of what that might look like. So this is a kind of famous JS bin that somebody made a while back that's since been like taken and played with and optimized, but it shows what it is to render things with different JavaScript frameworks. So this is Backbone. So it's animating all of these little circles and other circles, and it's going through 100, and it basically says how many milliseconds it takes per loop. It's about 21 milliseconds per loop. And then if I do it with React, it's about twice as fast, right? So the reason this works is because React has this kind of intermediate layer between you and the DOM, and so you say, I want to update this component, and it actually tries to figure out the most efficient way to do that. And it kind of coalesces all your updates at once, and if you update something multiple times, it'll only actually redraw the DOM once, right? There's a lot more going on there, and I actually don't really understand all of it, but it's crazy cool. And if you're looking to get a lot of performance out of rendering, React is pretty awesome. Okay. So this doesn't like crash my browser. I'm just going to close it.
I saw that with Angular too, and Angular was also significantly faster than Backbone.
Angular is definitely faster than Backbone. Backbone is kind of like the dog when you do that. I didn't show you the Ember one because I'm not trying to be too Ember biased, but Ember has a new templating library that's going to be out like any day, and it's actually faster not only than all of the other ones, but it's faster than the native JavaScript one. Like somebody went and tried to optimize the native JavaScript. I don't understand why that is, but it looks good. It looks pretty. So sorry. Try not to be too Ember biased. Okay. So that is React. Okay, so React troll time. So React is, like a lot of these get described as like MVC frameworks or MV star frameworks, whatever you want to call it. React is very much just the view. So I think personally probably why I really actually liked using React is because it has a lot of similarities to Ember's view layer. And so if I don't need all the other junk, then I can just use that part. So if you kind of are looking for the controller layer or even the model layer, you're not going to get it out of React. It's not going to help. You have to figure that all out yourself. Also, let me actually just jump back to show you JSX. So, JSX, this is the worst. So, okay, let me go back to React here and show you this. If you go down here, this line right here, right? So they realize it's a little small. Let me try and bump it up. Oh, really, a lot. This is inline HTML in your JavaScript. Is anybody cringing right now? Is anybody like, ooh, you know? You don't have to do it this way. You can actually just manually create these DOM nodes with these React methods. But this is basically, you have to send this through a preprocessor, right? So you write a .jsx file, and there's a React preprocessor that goes and handles this and turns it into actual like React, methods and calls and stuff. I don't know. When I see this, this kind of messes with my mind. I'm like, I don't like writing HTML like in line with the JavaScript. It feels really funky. Okay, so that's the React troll JSX. What's up with that? Okay, number 3, routing. So assuming that your app is getting complicated enough, you start wanting to worry about multiple pages, right? It's not just some single page that's updating in real time. You might want to go to other pages. You can imagine that you have an entire app written in JavaScript. So this is where Ember comes in. I think Ember does a really fantastic job of routing. So just a quick, I guess I kind of gave a synopsis of where other things came from. Ember actually is a successor to Sprout Core, which is what Apple MobileMe was built on. So they built that in Sprout Core 1, and then Sprout Core 2 came out, and then they renamed it to Ember. So it's a big framework. It's very opinionated. It's kind of the Rails of JavaScript frameworks. So to look at this, we're going to go look at this localhost app.
I've heard people describe it as basically if Backbone has enough of a spine to have an opinion. I would agree with that. Like it definitely has that kind of a feel to it. So probably
a very big spine. Like, I mean, it's a pretty hefty thing, and it's got a lot going on, right? Like, if they do make Backbone with an opinion. Like Chaplin is one, and Marionette. Like, those are people that kind of like just barely extend Backbone. Like, Ember's a whole nother level. So this is an app that Murphy is currently building for the library. I'll talk about maybe how to get more info about that later, but there's going to be a app that the library hosts that is going to host local artists' CDs that people can then download and stream as a library member for free. So if you want to listen to local music, there's going to be this awesome place you can do it. And I think we're going to have probably somewhere between 50 and 100 albums like when it launches here in about a month. So this is the in-development app. I think the most important thing I want to show off is the routing. So if you pay attention to the URL bar up there, when I actually go click around on things, the URL bar just automatically updates. There's not really a whole lot to show off other than, like this is all happening client side, right? Like if I reload any of these pages as well, the client knows how to get to where it was before. So you can see there's like the hash mark up there that's actually, so the server is serving up the same page every single time, and then the client looks at the rest of the URL and says, okay, I know how to get where I'm going to go. I'm not going to show the code for this because it's, I don't know, showing code in Ember without any context is a little dangerous. It's like there's a lot going on. But this is like something Ember does really well. Like, and they have maintained for a long time that URLs in Ember are like a first-class citizen, right? We want you to be able to link into your app. We don't want you to have to feel like that you're off in JavaScript land and the back button doesn't work. I mean, they hold those things very dear, which is cool. So I'm all about that. Okay, so Ember troll time. Okay, steep learning curve, right? Like I kind of mentioned it. There's like, I think several people in here I've even talked to have said like, oh, I tried to learn Ember like twice, and every time I was like, like, yeah, there's a lot happening. The documentation has gotten much better. There's a lot of good examples out there now, but still there's a lot of concepts to understand, a lot of moving pieces. So it's opinionated, it's complex, it's large. It has this awful get-set syntax, so it has this whole internal observer system that makes data binding and doing all kinds of really fun things with that really, really easy and awesome. And when you update one part of the app, like everything else changes. So setting up that kind of player type interface that's there was crazy easy in Ember. It was like, oh, you want a player and you want all the buttons to update like in the tracks and do everything right? It was like, oh, it took me like 2 minutes, right? But you have to use this get set syntax rather than using normal JavaScript like, key equals or whatever. Animations kind of suck in Ember too. They're still trying to figure this one out. So you can do some animations. It's not like impossible, but there's no really like framework way to do it. And so that leads to problems sometimes. Okay, so number 4, the data model. So you have your API, you want to get data from it, right? And you can imagine that if you get complex enough on the client side, you want there to be some kind of layer that handles that for you, right? Maybe you have relationships that you want, persisted, or you want to be able to handle those on the client side and represent those in some way. You want to be able to persist back to the API and kind of not really think about it, like have a save method on an object. If you have an existing format like JSON API, you want it to just understand that. If you've already loaded data, you want an identity map. So if I've hit an album page on the Yahara Music Project once and I go to another page and I go back to that first page, I already have the data. I shouldn't need to hit the server again. Maybe you want to undo what happens when you get errors, failures, those kinds of things. And the truth is almost none of the JavaScript frameworks really deal with this. Like if you look at Angular, Backbone, even Ember out of the gate, like it's like, use something like jQuery Ajax, right? Like figure it out yourself how you're going to get data in here. Once it's in a JavaScript object, that's what we're going to consume. So even like Backbone Sync is like, if you look at the code, it's like a super thin wrapper around jQuery Ajax. React is the same way as well. So I'm not going to talk about Ember Data because I said I'm not going to talk about Ember too much. But Ember Data is like a project to try to handle this later. So I spent actually a lot of time. I was like, I got to find another JavaScript framework that does this so I can like figure it out and tell you guys about it. And there is one. There's like a new one. So this came out a couple months ago. It's called orbit.js, built by a guy in New Hampshire, and it's trying to be a framework agnostic kind of model and API layer in JavaScript. So the idea is you could use it with Ember, you could use it with React, you could use it with Angular. I don't have a demo because they didn't really have a good one set up on their website. I don't even know if I'm going to show you their website because it's like really not that interesting. It's really tries out of the gate to do a bunch of stuff with the JSON API.org standard, which if you haven't seen that is pretty awesome, so check it out. But I was just actually excited that there was kind of this framework agnostic model and API layer. So troll time, you know, I never heard of it, so I was like, you know, it has like 500 stars on GitHub. It's not nothing. So it's still very new. Could be totally terrible, right? Okay, number 5, web components. Can I just get a show of hands who knows when I say web components, what I'm talking about? Maybe? Okay, so we'll go over this quickly. So web components are this kind of next level of you know, W3C spec for how the web is going to work. So imagine this situation. So web components are custom HTML elements, right? So if I want to have this awesome custom HTML element that is a Doge element, and I can put stuff in there, and then, you know, that is what would render on the page, right? That is what a web component is. So a lot of these frameworks have concepts that are web component-like or very similar. Angular does, Ember does, React does. React basically kind of is trying to be web components. Basically, everybody's saying, well, web components are going to exist in like 2 or 3 years, and they're probably going to suck, so we're going to make them ourselves right now, and hopefully then we'll kind of catch up to whatever ends up being approved by the W3C and comes out in all the browsers. So the one that excels at this to like insane levels is Polymer. So there's this, I couldn't really find much about Polymer and where it started, but it's like fairly popular. There's a lot of stars on GitHub. So Polymer basically takes this approach that everything is a web component. So let me get out of this. Okay. So this is the Polymer to-do MVC example. So there's some JavaScript here, which is just, you know, Polymer stuff. You don't really know about that. But this is what the actual HTML looks like. So you can see there is a, let me get this bigger. This is what their HTML, index.html looks like, right? You can see there are custom elements, TD to-dos, TD model, Polymer local storage. And so the idea is that you create these custom web components and then you just dump them into your HTML and they just work, right? And you know, it handles logic and handles all kinds of fancy stuff for you. And which is cool, right? I mean, this is very simple. You can imagine creating lots of reusable things that you could reuse across multiple apps, multiple websites, all kinds of stuff. Troll time is actually the problem. So I don't know if you saw there's a local storage element. Like, what? You want to put an element on the page, like, you know, HTML is supposed to be like your content, and that's what is telling your app, like, where to get its data and store its data from. All right, that seems really funky to me. Okay, so that's it. That's like 5 things. I didn't cover like all the things. I tried to pick like, you know, the top things that I think are important when you're looking at these different tools. I didn't cover, by the way, some designer in here is probably freaking out right now because this is like the only bold text I use in the entire presentation. So I didn't cover like build tools. So there's all kinds of crazy build tools out there. How are you actually going to take one of these apps and build it up and generate it? Node is kind of like the new hotness there, but there's a lot of other stuff as well. And various tools within Node. Templating libraries. So some of these frameworks can be used with different templating libraries, or they have their own templating library that you have to use, like JSX, or you know, you can swap some in. There's also some cool stuff out there that is related to kind of JavaScript server hybrid apps, where the app is actually rendered on the server, and then you can, you know, load it up on the client and interact with it. There's some stuff with Backbone specifically, like Airbnb has done, that is very like JavaScript, you know, client server hybrid stuff, where the same thing happens on both sides, and it's supposed to be really awesome and fast. And then deployment, you know, how you actually get one of these like out in the wild. And this is like everything from you create a Sinatra app or a Node app to serve it up, or you just put it on S3 and you have like a domain pointing out. I think that's like one of the coolest parts for me. There's an app I've out there that kind of tries to make a better version of GitHub Issues that's built in Ember. And it's not currently, but it could just be served up from S3, right? So it basically talks to GitHub all via its API, and you could just put it on a bucket and say this is where the app lives, and then people would load it up, and it authenticates through GitHub's API. So pretty neat. Okay, so last items and kind of shameless plug time. So if this is like the coolest thing ever, and you're like, all I want to do is build JavaScript front ends, there's a couple cool projects I'm working on that I just like to plug.